Hello everyone. Tonight we're starting with the story of a man so feared that entire armies chased him, and so famous that Americans later shouted his name while jumping out of airplanes. From scalp bounties that turned human hair into pocket money, to raids where 30 men made fools out of 5,000 soldiers, to ending your life not on a battlefield but in an Oklahoma ditch after falling off your horse, this is Geronimo's War. If you enjoy these strange slices of history, take a moment to like and subscribe. It honestly helps me keep digging into the things school textbooks would rather skip, but only do it if you actually want more of this kind of storytelling. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this little community stretch across time zones like a campfire circle. So, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm, and let the noise of the day settle. Let's walk into the dust, the raids, and the visions that kept Geronimo alive against impossible odds. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine you weren't born into fluorescent light, hospital wristbands, and an Instagram announcement. No, picture yourself arriving in 1829, in a clearing under a sky so wide, it practically mocked you for being small. Your people would have called you Goya, which, in case you're wondering, means the one who yawns. Yes. Your grand entrance into the world was immortalized not as fierce or majestic, but as the baby who couldn't stop looking bored. Already, you see, fate had a sense of humor. You belonged to the Bodanco band of the Chiricahua Apache, a branch of a people who had mastered the art of survival in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth, the deserts and mountains of what's now Arizona and New Mexico. Forget running water or delivery apps. Your family knew how to track a deer across stone. How to coax edible roots from soil that looks like it was designed by someone who hated humans, and how to turn mountains into fortresses. This wasn't survival as a hobby, it was survival as a birthright. And the thing about Apache life, unlike the tidy chief and tribe diagrams you saw in grade school, is that it wasn't centralized. There was no pharaoh, no king, no single voice of command. Leadership came from respect, persuasion, and the kind of charisma you couldn't fake. You followed the person who'd kept you alive last winter, not the one who had the fanciest hat. Which meant you grew up in a society allergic to dictatorships, built instead on bands, families, and networks of alliances that shifted like desert winds. Still, Goya stood out, not because he was born into royalty, the Apache had no patience for that nonsense, but because he carried something heavier, visions. He wasn't just a warrior to be, he was a medicine man in training. Someone whose dreams weren't dismissed as random brain static, but treated as maps of the unseen. Later, people would say his power came from these visions, his ability to endure, to survive, and to inspire men to follow him into situations where logic said, absolutely not. But let's be clear, in these early years, you weren't Geronimo yet. That name would come later, whispered by Mexican soldiers who discovered that shouting San Geronimo while trying not to die had a way of sticking. For now, you were Goya, a boy raised on stories around the fire, where elders recited how your people had roamed the land since time immemorial, long before borders sliced through it. You learned that the mountains didn't just protect you, they were kin. The rivers weren't just water, they were the veins of the earth. You were taught to see a landscape most outsiders called barren as a place of abundance if, of course, you knew where to look and how to keep your mouth shut about it. So you grew up in a world that prized stealth, patience, and memory. Every rock formation had a trail behind it, every canyon a story of an ambush or escape. Childhood meant less hide-and-seek, and more hide or dash. You single quotes LL get found and that single quotes S the dash end. You absorbed this knowledge like it was oxygen, until one day you realized it wasn't just about surviving, it was about resisting. Because already, by the time you could walk, there were intruders poking into your homeland, drawing maps of places they'd never belonged, and announcing rules nobody had asked for. And it was only a matter of time before those intrusions turned into something that would rip your life apart and rename you, not just as Goya the Yawner, but as Geronimo, the man who would come to symbolize defiance itself. So here you are, Goya growing into your name, learning the desert like other kids learn multiplication tables. You've got a wife now, Alapi, and 3 children, the beginnings of a family life that even in a harsh world feels steady, almost sacred. And then, in 1851, it happens, the kind of event that doesn't just change your life, but rewires your soul. You'd gone south with a trading party into Chihuahua, Mexico, near the town of Trips like this weren't rare. Raiding and trading bled into each other, and the Apache had long crossed those borders that, frankly, only existed on other people's maps. While you were out, Mexican soldiers descended on your camp. When you returned, you found your mother, your wife, and your 3 children dead. Pause for a second and picture that. A man who had grown up with the desert whispering endurance into his bones, suddenly brought face to face with loss so total it cracked him in half. Later he would remember hearing voices, spirits telling him to seek revenge, giving him power in the face of grief. Some accounts say he walked into the wilderness alone, mourning until visions came. Whether you call that divine intervention or the human mind clawing for meaning, it turned him into something more dangerous than a fighter. It turned him into a man with nothing left to lose, and revenge wasn't abstract. The Mexican army had already perfected the business of fear. Since the 1830s, Chihuahua had been paying bounties for Apache scalps, treating extermination like a civic duty. A man's scalp fetched more than a woman's, and a child's even less, as if cruelty could be organized by price list. Imagine shopping receipts for genocide. That was the reality you walked back into. So Goya began what the Mexicans would soon come to dread: raids of retaliation. This wasn't chaos for its own sake. These were calculated strikes, slipping across the border, seizing horses, burning supply points, and vanishing before the dust settled. Soldiers would later say they swore they heard him laughing in the dark, as if vengeance itself had found a voice. It was in these battles that the nickname Geronimo supposedly appeared. Mexican troops, under attack, shouted, "San Geronimo, ayúdanos," calling on Saint Jerome for protection. Whether they meant it as prayer or curse, it stuck. And nothing, absolutely nothing, erodes an enemy's morale like knowing they've named their own nightmare. From then on, you weren't just Goya the Honor, you were Geronimo, the man whose grief had boiled into strategy. You learned to move with a kind of surgical cruelty, hit hard, vanish faster, leave the survivors trembling. You weren't leading an army with banners and drums, you were leading small war parties, each man bound less by discipline and more by shared rage. And if anyone thought this was temporary, some flare of anger that would fade, they were wrong. Because grief doesn't fade when the ground that holds your family's blood is the same ground you walk every day. Instead, it hardens, it reshapes you. And while you still walked the desert trails of your ancestors, now you walked them as someone the world couldn't quite categorize. A medicine man with visions, a father without a family, and a fighter who believed the spirits had personally armed him for revenge. And that kind of man doesn't stop at one raid. He becomes the storm everyone else has to track, which is exactly what Geronimo did next, folding himself into the larger Apache struggle, and stepping into a world of alliances, rivalries, and leaders with their own scars to carry. So now you're Geronimo, stitched together out of grief, visions, and a talent for slipping through cracks the enemy didn't even know existed. But here's the thing, you're not a lone wolf, despite how the dime novels and Hollywood scripts would later sell it. The Apache world didn't work that way. Leadership wasn't about a crown or a throne, it was about who could keep people alive without getting them all killed in the process. And in that desert chessboard, you weren't the only piece in motion. There was Cochise, chief of the Chokanan band, a man whose patience was long until it wasn't. Think of him as the elder statesman of Apache diplomacy. When his trust was betrayed in the Bascom affair of 1861, he switched from negotiation to war, and the borderlands burned for over a decade. To ride with him was to see strategy woven with endurance, the long game of survival. Then you had Mangus Coloradus, the towering Bidonko leader, so broad-shouldered he was said to fill a doorway. He united bands, struck deals, and commanded respect across generations. He was also the tragic proof of why trusting outsiders was a losing gamble. Captured under a flag of truce by US soldiers in 1863, tortured and killed. His murder seared into Apache memory like a brand. You'd carry that story forward, not because you had to, but because every death carved into you another reason not to lay down arms. And then there was Ja, the Nedni leader, a man whose voice shook like thunder when it pleased him to speak, which was rare. His stutter made him hesitant in conversation, but on the battlefield his commands were clear, decisive, brutal. He was the storm you didn't see coming until it swallowed you whole. With Ja, you shared more than raids, you shared belief in the Sierra Madre as refuge, in mobility as weapon, and in never trusting the word of those who saw your people as obstacles rather than neighbors. Finally, Nachkuch's son, younger, ambitious, still sharpening the edges of leadership. He would one day carry the title of chief, but in these years he was finding his footing, learning when to lead and when to lean on your firebrand reputation. Together, you formed a strange constellation: elders, warriors, visionaries, each with a different shade of rage at the encroaching world. This wasn't a government. It wasn't a council chamber with polished floors and law books. It was a web, shifting, alive, bound by kinship and necessity. Sometimes you agreed, sometimes you fought, sometimes you raided together, sometimes you scattered into the mountains like smoke. What held you all was less hierarchy and more survival instinct. If you didn't adapt, you died, and if one of you fell, the others carried the fight. You, Geronimo, weren't the top chief. That's the myth the newspapers loved to print because they couldn't handle nuance. What you were was something slipperier, a war leader, a medicine man, a kind of spiritual powder keg who could inspire men to follow you into the teeth of death. And in a world where alliances shifted like sand dunes, that made you both valuable and dangerous. Because every raid, every battle, every skirmish was part of a larger Equosian Apache bands trying to survive an onslaught of settlers, miners, armies, and governments that all claimed the land under your feet. To face that tidal wave, you needed not one leader, but many, and you needed the kind of coordination that made your enemies mutter in frustration. How do they keep slipping away? And the answer was, simply you were never just one man. You were a network, a spider's web stretched across desert and mountain, anchored by the names Cochise, Mangas, Coloradas, Janach, and yes, Geronimo. Pull one thread, and the whole web trembled, but cut it. That was a task no foreign army had quite figured out. Which brings us to the geography itself, the jagged mountains and sun-scorched deserts that weren't just backdrops, but weapons in their own right, sharpening your resistance against Mexico and, soon enough, the United States. Let me tell you about the person you could have been if your childhood playground wasn't a suburban cul-de-sac, but a desert borderland where survival was basically an extreme sport nobody signed up for. You'd have grown up knowing the Sierra Madre Mountains like an extension of your ribcage and treating the desert like your pantry, if your pantry could also kill you when it felt like it. This was the Mexico-Apache frontier, and it was less friendly border crossing and more centuries-long blood feud. Picture towns like Sonora and Chihuahua, garrisoned with presidios, their soldiers marching out not for defense but for raids into Apache territory. By the 1830s, Mexican states had turned extermination into an economic policy, paying cold hard cash for Apache scalps. Men, women, children, each had a price tag. And yes, children's scalps went at a discount, because apparently genocide had a sliding scale. Nothing says civilization quite like a bounty system for human hair. Now, if you were Geronimo, you didn't need pamphlets on asymmetric warfare, you lived it. Apache raids were brutal in their efficiency, swift strikes, stolen horses, and immediate retreat into terrain so unforgiving it seemed designed by a god who liked irony. The Sierra Madre wasn't just rugged, it was practically allergic to foreign armies. Jagged canyons, blind ravines, and ridgelines that doubled as sniper nests. Soldiers might chase you in, but they rarely chased you out. Every raid was a blend of necessity and message. Horses weren't luxuries, they were survival engines. Food wasn't just taken, it was reallocated from invaders who had planted themselves on land your people knew before Mexico had ever drawn a flag. And retaliation wasn't abstract. If soldiers burned your camp, you burned their village. If they cut down your people, you cut deeper. It was a cycle that fed itself on blood and dust. And while outsiders framed Apache fighters as bandits, let's not kid ourselves, this was war. But a war where one side had governments, payrolls, and newspapers, and the other had mobility, memory, and terrain. If the Mexicans had bureaucrats with ledgers, you had scouts who could read hoofprints on rock and vanish into shadows. One side filed reports, the other side left none. Guess which side usually slept better? What outsiders couldn't grasp was how much the land itself was your ally. The desert wasn't empty, it was alive with knowledge. Springs tucked into hidden folds of rock, mesquite pods ground into meal, agave roasted into sweet sustenance, trails marked not by signs but by the subtle bend of grass or the shape of stones stacked generations earlier. To chase an Apache into that world was to walk blindfolded into a labyrinth where your enemy had drawn every line. And yet, it wasn't just about survival. There was humiliation woven into these raids. Imagine Presidio soldiers, trained, armed, marching out with banners, only to be outwitted by small war parties slipping like smoke across mountains. Each failure didn't just sting, it undermined the state's entire authority. Because how do you claim sovereignty over land when you can't even keep hold of your own horses overnight? So, in this theater of dust and blood, Geronimo sharpened his legend, not as a general of vast armies, but as a man whose name carried the weight of inevitability. If you saw smoke rising, if horses vanished in the night, if shadows moved where none should, you whispered his name. And whispering, in a world of scalp bounties and raids, was already admitting fear. But if Mexico thought this war was exhausting, they hadn't yet seen what happened when the United States arrived with forts, telegraphs, and the smug certainty of manifest destiny. That's when the struggle shifted northward, and the desert had to absorb yet another empire's ambitions. So, you've been running circles around Mexican presidios, and then one day you look north and Joyan, other empire shows up. The United States, fresh from annexing half of Mexico's territory after 1848, rolls into your homeland with a peculiar combination of arrogance and naivety. Picture them, engineers hammering telegraph poles into soil they don't understand, settlers planting towns where there's no reliable water, and soldiers in wool uniforms wilting under the desert sun, convinced technology will tame the landscape. It's almost cute, if it weren't lethal. The Americans built forts. Fort Bowie, Fort Apache, Fort Bowie again, after the first one wasn't enough, dorting the land, like safety pins trying to hold together a fabric that never wanted stitching. These forts weren't just defensive posts, they were the symbols of intrusion, spitting distance from Apache strongholds. Miners followed, hunting silver and copper, and ranchers grazed cattle across valleys that had fed your people for generations. At first, relations weren't hopeless. There were tentative talks, even trade. But then came 1861 and the infamous Bascom Affair, the diplomatic equivalent of lighting a match in a powder keg. Here's the short version. A rancher's stepson was kidnapped near St. Noita, and Lieutenant George Bascom, a man with the subtlety of a brick, accused Cochise of the crime. Cochise denied it. To prove his point, he walked into Bascom's tent under a flag of truce. Bascom responded by trying to arrest him on the spot. Spoiler, that did not go over well. Cochise slashed his way out of the tent, escaped, and in retaliation, took hostages. Bascom counter-retaliated. The entire standoff ended in executions, betrayals, and a firestorm of vengeance. If diplomacy had been a fragile glass, Bascom hurled it against a canyon wall, and then asked why everyone was so upset. For you, Geronimo, watching all this unfold was confirmation that the new power wasn't going to be any different from the old one. Except now it came with more troops, more guns, and a much longer supply chain. The Americans weren't content to defend their settlers. They intended to manage Apache life, to herd entire bands onto defined tracts of land, as if people who had lived free across mountains for centuries could be convinced to sit quietly in one dusty corner. And this is where irony sharpens. The US liked to call Apache resistance raiding or banditry. But let's be honest, what they were really facing was a war for existence. Every clash wasn't just about cattle or stolen horses, it was about the audacity of strangers deciding where you could live, when you could move, and what freedom you were allowed to keep. From this moment on, there was no going back. The Americans had effectively declared themselves the new landlords of the Southwest, and you, Geronimo, became a tenant who refused to pay rent. The Bascom Affair set fire to a peace that might have been possible, replacing it with decades of bitterness. And once the Americans dug in, they weren't leaving, so the fight shifted. The raids that once cut deep into Mexico began curling north, slamming into wagon trains, ranches, mining camps, telegraph lines, anything that represented this new invader. And the US, army slogging, sweating, cursing, discovered what Mexico already knew. Chasing Geronimo across deserts and mountains was like trying to nail smoke to the wind. But of course, the Americans had something Mexico hadn't perfected, the bureaucratic genius of reservations, and soon enough, they'd come up with the idea that the solution to the Geronimo problem was to confine you and your people onto plots of land that made San Jose parking lots look spacious. If you'd been born into Geronimo's world, This is the point where the story would start sounding less like war and more like bureaucratic torture. You see, the United States eventually realized it couldn't just chase you forever. Armies were expensive, miners were whining, settlers were panicking, and Washington wanted something that looked like order on paper. Their solution: reservations. Imagine telling a people who had lived across thousands of miles of mountain and desert, "Congratulations, here's your new home. It's a few square miles of dust. Please enjoy." In the 1870s, the U.S. carved out the Chiricahua Reservation near Tularosa, New Mexico. On paper, it was a compromise. Your people could live together under government oversight. In practice, it was an exercise in manipulation. Settlers complained, officials meddled, and before long, you were told to move again, this time to San Carlos, Arizona, a place the Apache quickly renamed Hell's 40 Acres. Let's pause on San Carlos, because it deserves its reputation. The land was arid and unhealthy, with water scarce and malaria buzzing out of the Gila River. The rations provided by the U.S. government were inadequate, often spoiled, and sometimes stolen outright by corrupt agents. Imagine standing in line for food, only to discover the man in charge had sold half of it to the nearest town for profit. Hunger, disease, and despair were constant companions. And remember, this wasn't some monolithic Apache tribe, all living happily together. The government, in its genius, dumped multiple Apache bands Chiricahua, Western Mescalero, White Mountain on to the same reservation, ignoring rivalries, traditions, and sheer common sense. It was like forcing several feuding families into one small apartment and locking the door. Surprise! Tensions exploded. You, Geronimo, found yourself restless in this new reality. Here was a people born into movement, told to stay put, born into autonomy, told to obey. Every attempt at peace felt like suffocation dressed up as benevolence, and every promise made by U.S. officials collapsed like wet adobe. Treaties weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Peace talks usually meant surrender, and surrender usually meant another forced relocation. So what did you do? You resisted the only way you knew how, by leaving. Time and again, you led small bands off San Carlos, slipping past soldiers and vanishing into the Sierra Madre. To the Americans, this was rebellion. To you, it was common sense. Why starve in a government prison when the mountains still offered freedom, however dangerous? Of course, each escape was met with military campaigns designed to drag you back. Generals like George Crook would hunt you with Apache scouts, your own people, pressed into service against you. This only deepened the bitterness, turning survival into a tangle of divided loyalties. But San Carlos left its mark. It showed just how far the U.S. was willing to go to force control, not just over land, but over identity itself. By trying to confine a people who had thrived on mobility, the government didn't just provoke raids, it manufactured them. Every attempt to cage you created the very resistance it claimed to be preventing, and so the desert became your answer. Once again, he slipped into the mountains, leading raids not only into Arizona, but back into Mexico, using the border itself as a shield. Because if the Americans thought San Carlos would end Geronimo's war, they'd miscalculated badly. The reservation wasn't a solution, it was a fuse. And lighting that fuse set the stage for the next phase, the long, grueling campaigns of General Crook, who thought he could outmaneuver you with maps, scouts, and just enough diplomacy to pretend he wasn't planning your capture. Let me tell you what it meant to fight like Geronimo. Forget uniforms, bugles, and neat lines of men marching into musket fire. Your battlefield was chaos on purpose, and your greatest weapon wasn't just a rifle or a stolen cavalry horse, which was the ability to disappear before the enemy even realized they'd been hit. Picture this: a war party of maybe 30 men, not an army, not even a regiment, just a handful of warriors stripped down to essentials. You moved light, one horse each, sometimes two if you needed to swap for speed, dried meat tucked into pouches, weapons cleaned and ready. No tents, no wagons, no baggage. If you couldn't carry it, it didn't come. That was the rule. Mobility wasn't a tactic, it was survival. When you struck, it was sudden and surgical. A raid might target a ranch, a stagecoach, or a small garrison. You'd ride in, seize what you needed, horses, ammunition, food, and then vanish back into the desert. To the settlers, it looked like ghosts had descended, left fire and blood, and evaporated into thin air. To you, it was simply good planning. You knew the ridges, the canyons, the waterholes, hidden from outsiders. The Sierra Madre wasn't just a refuge, was a labyrinth. Only you had the map too. The US Army, with all its men and money, struggled against this. Soldiers marched heavy, dragging supply wagons through desert heat, dying of thirst before they even saw an enemy. By the time they reached a site of attack, you were already days away, melting into trails that split and rejoined like veins across the land. Scouts would chase hoofprints, only to find they ended on bare rock. Whole companies wandered in circles, cursing your name. The army had rifles, but you had time, knowledge, and patience. And patience beats hardware when the land itself fights for you. You mastered deception too. One group would lure soldiers into a canyon, vanish up the slopes, and then ambush from above. Tracks were deliberately scattered, fires lit in places you'd already abandoned. Even rumors became tools. Soldiers would chase whispers of your presence hundreds of miles, wearing themselves out while you waited, rested, and prepared the next strike. And then there was the psychological warfare. Stories of Geronimo spread faster than facts. Soldiers swore you could see in the dark, that bullets didn't kill you, that spirits guided your hand. You didn't invent these tales, but you never corrected them either. Why should you? Fear was free, and it slowed your enemies down more effectively than bullets. But the tactics weren't just about fighting. They were about endurance. The desert demanded stamina that outsiders didn't have. You could ride 70 miles in a day, sleep under a cloak on bare stone, drink from stagnant pools, eat roasted agave, and keep moving. Soldiers accustomed to tents and rations couldn't match that rhythm. You didn't just outfight them, you outlasted them. The irony, of course, is that to the US military, you weren't a general. You were a raider, a renegade, but anyone paying attention could see you were conducting a masterclass in guerrilla warfare a century before textbooks would coin the term. Every raid said the same thing. You may have forts, guns, and flags, but this land breathes with us, not you. And it was precisely that mastery of terrain and movement that drove the Americans to call in General Crook, a man who thought he could turn your own tactics against you by recruiting Apache scouts and chasing you deep into Mexico. So here's the setup. The US Army has tried everything: forts, treaties, bribes, and still you, Geronimo, keep slipping back into the Sierra Madre like the desert's favorite ghost. By the early 1880s, Washington's patience is gone. Settlers are in a panic, and newspapers are screaming for action. Enter General George Crook, a man with a reputation for pragmatism, a face like a weathered boot, and the unnerving idea that if you can't beat the Apache, you might as well hire some of them. Yes, Crook's not-so-secret weapon wasn't just more soldiers, it was Apache scouts, men who knew the mountains, the trails, the tricks, because they'd grown up in the same world as you. Some joined willingly, others out of necessity. But the effect was brutal. Suddenly the US Army could track you with the same precision you'd once used to track them. Imagine fighting your own reflection, except this reflection is now on the payroll of the people you hate. Crook launched his 1883 campaign deep into Mexico, hauling hundreds of troops across deserts and mountains that had broken armies before. And yet, with Apache scouts guiding them, they managed what seemed impossible. They reached your strongholds. That spring, you surrendered, temporarily brought back to San Carlos under promises of fair treatment. For a moment, it looked like Crook had cracked the code. But promises, as you knew too well, never lasted. San Carlos remained a prison in all but name. Rations short, agents corrupt, and the weight of confinement unbearable. Within a year, you and your followers bolted again, crossing into Mexico with raids that left settlers and soldiers scrambling. Crook had barely finished celebrating before he was forced to start the chase all over again. The 1885 to 1886 campaign was the breaking point. Crook pursued you into the Sierra Madre with relentless pressure. His troops set up heliograph stations mirrors, flashing signals across mountains to coordinate movements, like some 19th century desert Wi-Fi. Skirmishes erupted, negotiations stalled, and at one point, Crook himself sat across from you in a tense meeting, trying to coax a surrender with promises everyone knew were shaky at best. But you didn't trust him. Why would you? You'd seen Mangas Colorados murdered under a flag of truce. You'd watched every treaty crumble like dry adobe. To surrender was to gamble your life and your people's fate on words you didn't believe. So, once again, you chose the mountains over the paper promises. Crook, exhausted, eventually resigned, his reputation bruised by a war that refused to end. In his place came General Nelson A. Miles, a man with less patience for negotiation and more appetite for overwhelming force. Crook had at least tried diplomacy. Miles would bring numbers, technology, and a willingness to hunt you to the edge of the earth. And yet, through it all, your defiance carved itself deeper into legend. Each escape embarrassed the US military in ways no battlefield defeat could bear. How could the most powerful army on earth not pin down a band of barely a few dozen warriors? Newspapers mocked, settlers fumed, politicians raged, and still your shadow slipped from canyon to canyon, as if the desert itself conspired to keep you free. But time was catching up. Resources drained, allies wore thin, and the US was closing its grip tighter with each campaign. The noose was forming, and by 1886, the stage was set for the last act of resistance, the infamous showdown at Skeleton Canyon. By 1886, you, Geronimo, were running on grit and ghosts. The raids had become harder, the mountains harsher, and the circle of your pursuers tighter. You weren't leading an army anymore, just a handful of families, warriors, women, children, maybe 38 souls in all. And yet, somehow, that tiny band had managed to tie down thousands of US and Mexican soldiers, humiliate generals, and keep headlines screaming from coast to coast. Imagine the Pentagon losing sleep over a neighborhood softball team, and you'll have the scale of it. But exhaustion doesn't care about legends. Supplies dwindled, horses faltered, and even spirits have their limits. General Nelson Miles had replaced Crook, and he wasn't interested in half measures. He deployed nearly 5,000 soldiers, plus Mexican troops and Apache scouts, blanketing the borderlands like an iron net. Heliographs flashed orders across the desert, columns marched in coordinated sweeps, and every canyon became a trap. It wasn't just pursuit anymore, it was suffocation. The breaking point came when Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, a wiry officer fluent in Apache, was sent to negotiate. He rode into the Sierra Madre with just a few scouts. No massive escort, no show of force, just words and nerve. And against all odds, you agreed to meet. The scene was tense. Geronimo, the most feared Apache war leader of the century, sitting across from a pale lieutenant carrying promises he barely believed himself. The terms were simple in writing, brutal in reality. Surrender, and you and your people would be relocated, kept under U.S. authority, treated fairly. But you'd heard those lines before. Still, the truth was gnawing. Your people were starving, hunted, boned. Even the strongest warrior can't fight on an empty stomach forever. On September 4, 1886, in the desolate expanse of Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, you laid down your rifle. The ceremony itself was strangely anticlimactic. No grand speeches, no staged theatrics, just a man handing over the symbol of defiance he'd carried for decades. But the implications were seismic. With your surrender, the Apache Wars conflicts that had spanned generations, outlasted empires, and defined the Southwest were declared over. Newspapers hailed it as the end of an era. The army congratulated itself, and Washington exhaled relief. But here's the bitter twist. You hadn't surrendered to mercy. You'd surrendered to survival, and survival meant exile. You weren't taken back to San Carlos or allowed to live freely in your homeland. Instead, you and your followers were marched east, first to Florida, then Alabama, then Oklahoma, stripped not just of land, but of the possibility of ever returning to it. You weren't a prisoner for a few months. You were a prisoner of war until your death in 1909. And if that sounds like a cruel joke, well, history specializes in those. You fought to keep your homeland, and the reward for your resistance was permanent captivity. Skeleton Canyon wasn't the triumph of one side over another. It was exhaustion forcing compromise, then compromise turning into captivity. And yet, even in surrender, the legend grew. The US Army had crushed empires, marched across continents, and still needed thousands of men to corner one band of Apache in the desert. If you were a symbol of defeat, you were also a symbol of something else: in yielding resistance, survival against impossible odds. But captivity wasn't the end of your story. The trains that hauled you east carried not just bodies, but the weight of a people's displacement. Exile in Florida and Alabama would be its own kind of war this time, not with rifles and raids, but with hunger, disease, and the slow erosion of freedom. So you surrendered at Skeleton Canyon, and if you thought that meant a quiet retirement, maybe some space in the desert to plant corn and tell stories. No, the US had other plans. Instead of letting you return to San Carlos, or any corner of your homeland, you and your people were branded with a title you'd carry to your grave: prisoners of war. And the army, always efficient with logistics, decided the best way to keep you under control was to haul you thousands of miles away from everything you knew. First stop, Florida, 1886. Families were split. Warriors, including you, were shipped to Fort Pickens, a fortress braced against the Gulf of Mexico. Your wives and children, they were sent separately to Fort Marion in St. Augustine. Imagine the cruelty of surrendering to protect your people, only to have them torn apart by rail cars and ships. For men raised to value kinship above all, this was salt in the wound. Florida was no refuge. The climate was swampy, humid, and packed with diseases your bodies weren't ready for. Malaria, tuberculosis, and dysentery stalked your camps like shadows. Dozens of your people died, their graves dug in alien soil. Soldiers, tourists, and journalists gawked at you through the bars of your captivity. Once a feared name on both sides of the border, you were reduced to an exhibitor, living symbol of a conquered enemy. But Florida was just the beginning. In 1887, the army moved you again, this time to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. The journey itself killed more, and life there, a slightly less humid cage, but still a cage. Your people tried to adapt, planting gardens, sending children to missionary schools, stitching together scraps of normal life under military watch. But death rates were staggering. In the first decade, nearly a third of the exiled Chiricahua Apache died. And here's the kicker: you were still technically at war. The US never declared peace with you. Instead, year after year, you remained under the status of prisoner of war, even while planting crops, even while children grew up speaking English in mission classrooms. You'd handed over your rifle in Skeleton Canyon, but on paper, the war never ended. Bureaucracy has a way of making captivity eternal. Yet in this captivity, your image began to shift. The same press that once called you a bloodthirsty savage now turned you into a curiosity, a relic of a vanishing race. Visitors came to gawk. Newspapers published your photo. And suddenly, Geronimo wasn't just a war leader. He was a commodity someone Americans could point to and say, "See, the frontier is closed. We tamed him." You'd gone from scourge of two nations to unwilling mascot of manifest destiny. And through it all, you endured. You led prayers, held on to fragments of tradition, and tried to stitch dignity into a world designed to strip it away. Exile didn't break you, but it shrank your world, reducing mountains and deserts into compounds and barracks. By the 1890s, another move was coming, this time to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where you'd spend the rest of your life. And there, captivity would twist again, because in Oklahoma, you wouldn't just be a prisoner. You'd become a celebrity, paraded at world fairs and presidential inaugurations, selling photographs of yourself like souvenirs, the living paradox of America's obsession with the people it had crushed. By the 1890s, the US Army had shuffled you and your people yet again, this time to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And here's the irony. After decades of fighting to remain free in the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, you ended your days in a place whose main feature was grass. Endless grass. Not your homeland, not your mountains, not your rivers, just rolling plains that mocked every canyon you once called sacred. At Fort Sill, the military tried to reshape the Apache into farmers, as if decades of raiding, hunting, and moving could be erased by handing out plows and instruction manuals. Some of your people adapted out of necessity. Corn grew, cattle were raised, but the air carried no echo of your ancestors, no whisper of the Sierra Madre. Farming here wasn't survival in the old sense, it was survival in captivity, with the army checking your furrows like And then came the strangest twist of all, celebrity. By the early 20th century, America had a taste for nostalgia, craving images of the Wild West it had just finished dismantling. And who better to embody it than Geronimo, the man who had once terrified soldiers and settlers alike? Suddenly you were being carted out, not as a prisoner of war, but as an exhibit of history in the flesh. In 1904, you were displayed at the S. Louis World's Fair, sitting in a booth selling autographed photographs of yourself for 25 cents apiece. Think about that. A man once hunted by armies, now reduced to signing postcards like a traveling salesman of his own legend. Crowds lined up to gawk, to shake hands with the famous Geronimo, without a shred of awareness that the fame they adored was built on the ruin of your people. The spectacle didn't end there. In 1905, you rode in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in Washington, D.C. Imagine it, Geronimo, the name whispered in fear for decades, sitting in a carriage, waving at cheering crowds like a novelty act. Roosevelt used you as a prop, proof that the frontier was over, that America had triumphed. You smiled, you waved, because what else could you do? Refusal wasn't an option. Even in celebrity, you were still a prisoner. But it wasn't just showmanship. You also tried to use your visibility. You told your story, dictated it to S.M. Barrett, producing Geronimo's story of his life in 1906. Of course, the government censored it, trimming the sharper edges, making sure your words didn't sting too much. Still, it was your attempt to leave a record, to say, I was here, and this is how it was. In Oklahoma, you converted at least nominally to Christianity under the influence of missionaries. But you never abandoned the old ways. You still prayed in the Apache fashion, still spoke of visions, still tied your identity to the land you'd lost. Conversion was like celebrity, a costume you wore when the situation demanded it. Yet even in these late years, bitterness remained. You asked Roosevelt to send you home, back to your mountains, your homeland. The request was denied, always denied. You could ride in their parades, sign their photographs, sell your image to tourists. But freedom, the one thing you'd fought for your entire life, was never returned. And so your last years passed in this limbo, a warrior reduced to a farmer, a prisoner turned celebrity, a living contradiction paraded before the world, while dreaming of the desert that raised you. And then, in 1909, death came not on a battlefield, but in a ditch. After falling from your horse in the cold, pneumonia setting in. Even in death, the irony lingered. The man who survived endless battles, who outran armies across deserts, finally undone by a chill and bad luck. Let me tell you something most people miss about Geronimo. The man wasn't just a warrior. He was also a medicine man, someone whose authority didn't come only from raids and rifles, but from visions and rituals. If you'd been born into his world, you wouldn't have gone to therapy for your nightmares. You'd have listened to them, weighed them, and maybe acted on them. Dreams weren't background noise. They were messages, sometimes from ancestors, sometimes from forces that didn't need names. Geronimo believed his power came from a vision after the 1851 massacre that shattered his family. He said voices told him he would never die in battle, that bullets couldn't kill him, that he was destined to strike revenge. And whether you call that divine intervention, survivor's delusion, or sheer psychological grit, it worked. His men swore they saw bullets miss him, swore he moved with uncanny speed, swore his very presence in a fight shifted outcomes. When armies started whispering that he was bulletproof, he didn't correct them. Why ruin a perfectly good rumor? As a medicine man, he performed ceremonies, healed with herbs, led rituals, and sought visions in solitude. He was feared as much for his spiritual weight as for his war skills. Outsiders might call that superstition, but in a world where life balanced daily on knife edges of hunger, illness, and war, a leader with power in the unseen carried as much weight as one with power in the saddle. Even in captivity, he clung to these practices. At Fort Sill, he still prayed the old way, still sought visions, even while occasionally attending Christian services. He could sit politely through a missionary sermon, nod at the hymns, and then turn around and lead Apache prayers under the stars. To him, this wasn't contradiction. It was survival, adaptation. You learned to wear masks when the empire demanded it, but kept your real self where their gaze couldn't reach. And then came the autobiography, Geronimo's story of his life, dictated in 1906 to S. Barrett, a teacher who petitioned the War Department just to be allowed to take it down. Think of it, a man who had terrified two nations reduced to needing official permission to tell his own story. Even then, the government censored whole sections, stripping out criticism of U.S. policy. What survived was part confession, part performance, part reclamation. In it, Geronimo painted himself as not just a fighter, but a man wronged, a leader who resisted because every other path was closed. It wasn't a polished memoir, more like a voice cutting through layers of translation and censorship. But it gave him something, a chance to seize control of his image, if only a little. He wasn't just the wild figure newspapers made him. He was a man who had buried family, who had seen betrayal dressed as diplomacy, who had been both hunter and hunted. He wanted that remembered. What's eerie is how modern it feels. A man commodified by the very people who destroyed his world, trying to take back the narrative by telling his own version. Today, we'd call it controlling the brand. Back then, it was survival of memory. But here's the irony: your rituals could give you visions. Your autobiography could give you a voice, but none of it could give you back your land. And so the spiritual and the political stayed knotted together. Your faith keeping you steady, even as captivity made you a symbol, a curiosity, and sometimes an unwilling icon for the very empire you fought. And while you kept your visions alive, the Chiricahua people themselves were fighting another battle, holding their culture together under captivity, scattered between barracks, schools, and mission houses, trying to remember who they were while being told daily to forget. If you'd been one of Geronimo's people, the war wouldn't just have been about raids and gunfire. It would have been about the long, exhausting grind of survival after the fighting stopped, or rather, after the army declared it had stopped. Because for the Chiricahua Apache, surrender didn't mean peace, it meant captivity, and captivity demanded new forms of endurance. Here's the part the legends usually skip. Not everyone fought at Geronimo's side. Some Chiricahua became Apache scouts, tracking their own kin for the U.S. Army, often out of necessity, sometimes for rations, sometimes to keep their families alive. Imagine the impossible choice: hunt your cousin or watch your children starve. Loyalty wasn't a neat line in the sand, it was a constant negotiation between survival and betrayal. Families were torn, trust frayed, and scars like that don't fade in a generation. Meanwhile, women carried burdens that rarely make it into the headlines. During the long marches east Florida, Alabama, Oklahoma, it was women who kept families stitched together, who cooked with whatever rations weren't rotten, who nursed the sick when malaria and tuberculosis tore through the camps. Elders, too, bore the weight of memory, whispering stories to children in stolen moments, so that even in captivity, the past didn't vanish completely. Survival wasn't just about food and water anymore. It was about remembering who you were when everything around you screamed that you'd been erased. The death toll was staggering. At Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, nearly a third of the exiled Chiricahua died in the first decade. Think about that. Every meal, every funeral, every season brought the reminder that captivity was killing more of your people than bullets ever had. Children grew up surrounded not by the mountains of their ancestors, but by the fences of their jailers. Their first language became English in mission schools, where Christianity was taught alongside subtraction, and Apache traditions were treated as embarrassing relics. And yet, in the middle of all this, there was resilience. Gardens were planted, songs whispered, kinship maintained in the cracks of military surveillance. The Chiricahua held councils, shared food, and kept their rituals alive as best they could. When soldiers looked at them, they saw captives. But within those fences, families worked quietly to remain a people. Resistance wasn't always a raid. Sometimes it was refusing to forget. Geronimo's fame complicated things further. While he was paraded at fairs and presidential inaugurations, many of his people lived in grinding poverty, invisible to the cheering crowds. His notoriety brought some pride, yes, but also resentment. After all, one man's legend didn't feed the children or heal the sick. The weight of his name sat unevenly on those who had suffered beside him. This was the cruel paradox. The Chiricahua were remembered in history as Geronimo's people, but most of them endured captivity quietly, without photographs or parades, holding on to identity through small acts of defiance. The headlines belonged to him, the survival belonged to them, and survival would keep twisting, because while the Chiricahua adapted under military rule, America was busy mythologizing them into something else, interrelating Geronimo into a symbol of both savage resistance and patriotic nostalgia, depending on what the audience wanted. If you'd been one of Geronimo's people, the war wouldn't just have been about raids and gunfire. It would have been about the long, exhausting grind of survival after the fighting stopped, or rather, after the army declared it had stopped. Because, for the Chiricahua Apache, surrender didn't mean peace. It meant captivity, and captivity demanded new forms of endurance. Here's the part the legends usually skip. Not everyone fought at Geronimo's side. Some Chiricahua became Apache scouts, tracking their own kin for the U.S. Army, often out of necessity, sometimes for rations, sometimes to keep their families alive. Imagine the impossible choice: hunt your cousin, or watch your children starve. Loyalty wasn't a neat line in the sand. It was a constant negotiation between survival and betrayal. Families were torn, trust frayed, and scars like that don't fade in a generation. Meanwhile, women carried burdens that rarely make it into the headlines. During the long marches east Florida, Alabama, Oklahoma, it was women who kept families stitched together, who cooked with whatever rations weren't rotten, who nursed the sick when malaria and tuberculosis tore through the camps. Elders, to bore the weight of memory, whispering stories to children in stolen moments, so that even in captivity, the past didn't vanish completely. Survival wasn't just about food and water anymore. It was about remembering who you were when everything around you screamed that you'd been erased. The death toll was staggering. At Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, nearly a third of the exiled Chiricahua died in the first decade. Think about that. Every meal, every funeral, every season brought the reminder that captivity was killing more of your people than bullets ever had. Children grew up surrounded not by the mountains of their ancestors, but by the fences of their jailers. Their first language became English in mission schools, where Christianity was taught alongside subtraction, and Apache traditions were treated as embarrassing relics. And yet, in the middle of all this, there was resilience. Gardens were planted, songs whispered, kinship maintained in the cracks of military surveillance. The Chiricahua held councils, shared food, and kept their rituals alive as best they could. When soldiers looked at them, they saw captives, but within those fences, families worked quietly to remain a people. Resistance wasn't always a raid. Sometimes it was refusing to forget. Geronimo's fame complicated things further. While he was paraded at fairs and presidential inaugurations, many of his people lived in grinding poverty, invisible to the cheering crowds. His notoriety brought some pride, yes, but also resentment. After all, one man's legend didn't feed the children or heal the sick. The weight of his name sat unevenly on those who had suffered beside him. This was the cruel paradox. The Chiricahua were remembered in history as Geronimo's people, but most of them endured captivity quietly, without photographs or parades, holding on to identity through small acts of defiance. The headlines belonged to him. The survival belonged to them. And survival would keep twisting, because while the Chiricahua adapted under military rule, America was busy mythologizing them into something else entirely. Geronimo into a symbol of both savage resistance and patriotic nostalgia, depending on what the audience wanted. So here's the punchline to a life of raids, visions, and survival against empires. You didn't die in a blaze of glory. No last stand, no heroic cavalry charge, no bullet finally piercing the bulletproof man. No, your ending came in 1909, in the chill of an Oklahoma winter, after falling from your horse and lying all night in a ditch. By morning, you had pneumonia. A few days later, you were gone. Geronimo, scourge of Mexico, terror of Arizona, breaker of treaties, ended not with war cries, but with a cough. History does irony better than any novelist. You were buried at Fort Sill, still a prisoner of war even in death. Your grave was in foreign soil, far from the mountains that had cradled your people for centuries. You'd begged to return to your homeland, and presidents had smiled and nodded, then filed your request in the trash. Death didn't set you free. It locked you into Oklahoma dirt, while your spirit was supposed to wander westward, searching for canyons that no longer belonged to your people. But death didn't silence your name. If anything, it multiplied it. Geronimo became shorthand for courage, rebellion, daring words rarely attached to the actual Chiricahua, still living under military watch. Soldiers in World War II yelled your name as they leapt from planes, as if shouting the word of a man America had imprisoned could somehow make them braver. Skydivers still do it today, leaping into the void with your name on their lips. Imagine that. The US spent decades hunting you, and now its thrill-seekers borrow your ghost for fun. Your grave, too, became a subject of myth. Whispers claimed your skull was stolen by members of Yale's secret society. The Skull and Bones, supposedly including Prescott Bush, father of one president and grandfather of another. True or not, the story stuck, because of course America couldn't resist one last indignity, turning even your bones into symbols of power. And yet, despite all of this, you endured not just as legend, but as memory. For the Apache, you remained complicated. A hero, yes, but also a man whose decisions brought suffering. whose fame sometimes overshadowed his people's pain. For the United States, you became a paradox, feared in life, romanticized in death. The last free Apache, the enemy who became an icon, the prisoner who turned into a mascot for bravery. That's the legacy of Geronimo, a man born Goya a Burr, the one who yawns, who lost his family to soldiers, who turned grief into fire, who fought Mexico and America across deserts and mountains, and who died in captivity while his name soared into myth. If you had been him, your life would have been carved out of dust and hunger, revenge and vision, exile and irony. And maybe that's the strangest truth of all. The higher the legend rises, the more the man himself gets buried beneath headlines, beneath postcards, beneath parades, and rumors of stolen bones. Geronimo became a word the world still shouts, but the man, the father, the medicine leader, the exile, he rests in Oklahoma soil, still waiting to go home. He was not born in a palace, nor even in a village that the maps of empire cared to mark. His first cradle was the earth itself, soil pressed into dust beneath bare feet, shaped by kinship rather than by kings. His people measured worth not by coin or parchment, but by endurance, who could carry water further, who could remain silent longest under pain, who could remember the stories sung by elders when the fires dimmed. Childhood was not a separate stage, but an apprenticeship to resistance. Each scar on his skin a kind of curriculum, each whispered tale of betrayal and survival, an early textbook in the politics of being small before something large. The landscape that formed him was already occupied, though not in the way empire claimed it. Lines drawn on paper insisted it belonged to one crown or another, while local memories stubbornly held that the land had always been indivisible, stitched together by rivers and bloodlines. Growing up meant watching soldiers pass through, their uniforms stiff with dust, their weapons gleaming like imported arrogance. A boy, observing this spectacle, learned quickly what adults did not say aloud, that the army was less an enemy to defeat than a storm to outlast. He heard stories of ancestors who fought and vanished, who walked into forests and never returned, swallowed by the green silence of rebellion. Each tale blurred into myth, and each myth bent itself around a boy's imagination until defiance became less a choice than an inheritance. He learned the art of patience, how to wait for a fruit to ripen, how to track an animal by its faintest print, how to measure his own heartbeat when fear came too close. These were not school lessons, but they were far more useful when armies began appearing over the horizon. Even his name, carried from older generations, carried weight, a reminder of those who had already stood against impossible odds. In him the past was not memory, but an echo, restless, demanding, insistent that someone had to finish what others had begun. The birth of the rebel was not an act of defiance in itself. It was simply a continuation of a rhythm already pounding in the soil beneath his feet. And as he grew, so too did the realization that survival meant more than hiding. It meant shaping the land into an accomplice, bending the terrain into a shield. And so his story begins, not with swords clashing or banners waving, but with a boy staring at the ridgeline, watching the sun rise over territory claimed by two nations, knowing already that those borders meant nothing compared to the river that cut through them, carrying stories further downstream than any empire dared to follow. The ground beneath him was never neutral. It carried the grooves of centuries-old footpaths, hardened into memory, sacred groves where trees bent like elders in conversation, rivers that carved not only the soil but the very logic of survival. To outsiders it looked like wilderness, an untouched expanse awaiting conquest. To him it was a living script, one where every rock had a name and every bend in the water had witnessed something worth remembering. Empires tried to map it with straight lines, neat rectangles of possession, but straight lines never lasted long in a landscape made of slopes, floods, and forests that swallowed whole columns of soldiers. The land resisted in silence. Mud sucked the boots from marching feet, mosquitoes turned precision into fever, and mountain passes funneled armies into traps so narrow they could be picked apart like lice from hair. In this theater, the rebel found his first ally, not his people, not even his own cunning, but the terrain itself. His sense of belonging was stitched into this geography. It was not patriotism, because the word nation had little weight in a place where clan, spirit, and soil were already inseparable. When he spoke of our land, it was not a political slogan, but a literal truth. The land that fed them, healed them, and most crucially hid them. A ravine became a meeting hall, a cave became a treasury, a swamp, a weapon more powerful than a spear. Every contour of the earth carried potential, and he knew how to unlock it in ways foreign generals would never grasp. Anthropologists later wrote that the people of his region had a territorial consciousness, as if it were some quaint cultural trait. What they missed was that territory was not an idea but a body. To lose land was not to lose property. It was to lose one's tongue, one's ancestors, one's right to breathe. So when soldiers advanced under foreign banners, they were not seen as just men with rifles, but as intruders attempting to amputate a limb from a living organism. And in that organism, the rebel was no more than a nerve firing, twitching, sending jolts of defiance through the whole. The irony was sharp. Two nations claimed to own this place, each planting flags, drawing maps, and filing reports back to capitals that had never smelled its rains. Yet both underestimated the intimate alliance between man and land here. When he began to move against them, it wasn't as if he raised an army overnight. It was as if the forest itself tilted in his favor, branches leaning low, rivers running shallow, earth opening paths invisible to anyone else. His defiance began not with weapons, but with geography, and geography quietly, relentlessly was already choosing sides. And once the land had chosen, kinship inevitably followed, drawing family and clan into an army that owed more to bloodlines than to discipline. Before foreign surveyors arrived with their measuring chains and their fragile paper maps, there was no talk of two nations. The people who lived here thought in rivers, not borders. A mountain range was a relative, a guardian, not a boundary. Kinship spilled across valleys, the way smoke drifts, unbothered by where one kingdom supposedly ended and another began. What linked them together wasn't a flag or a tax collector, but obligations, etched deep into memory. Who your grandmother owed grain to, which clan your uncle had once married into, whose ancestors had fought alongside yours when famine came. Colonial officers later called these connections tribal, a word that shrank everything down to something primitive, as if this world had been childish until the bureaucrats arrived to teach it adulthood. But alliances here were sophisticated, overlapping, and maddeningly flexible. A man could belong to his mother's clan, fight alongside his father's lineage, and still owe loyalty to the spirits inhabiting the forest. Try drawing that on a map. And yet, when two nations insisted the land was theirs, they treated these networks as irrelevant, dismissing them as if they could be erased with ink. The rebel, however, understood them as his true arsenal. Where others saw scattered villages, he saw a web of relationships capable of transmitting news faster than a dispatch rider. A cousin in one valley might shelter him, an in-law in another might feed his men, and debts owed to his ancestors could still be collected in the form of spears raised at his call. His mobility, what baffled his enemies most, was never just about knowing the terrain. It was about moving through a dense network of invisible strings, each one binding people together in ways foreign generals could neither see nor sever. Borders, to him, were paper-thin illusions. Soldiers stationed on either side might belong to different governments, but to the farmers who supplied them, both were equally alien. And so, when he slipped from one jurisdiction into another, it wasn't that he had crossed a line, it was that he had returned to a cousin's hearth, or an elder's blessing, or a piece of ancestral ground no decree could truly confiscate. His rebellion then was not limited by the idea of nationhood. It thrived precisely because he refused to recognize that such borders existed at all. This blurred sense of belonging meant that his strategies looked less like military campaigns and more like kinship rituals extended into war. His fighters weren't soldiers in the formal sense. They were brothers, uncles, nephews, godsons, a human weave of loyalties that could scatter and reform at will. And out of this we've emerged the strange paradox of his defiance. Armies with drums and bugles marched like machines, while he moved like rumor, like smoke, like something almost invisible. It was here, in this dissonance between paper nations and lived worlds, that the true shape of his rebellion took form. And when he struck, he didn't wield cannons or cavalry, he wielded the quiet, lethal efficiency of the so-called weapons of the weak. What he carried into battle was rarely impressive to foreign eyes. A rusted musket here, a spear hardened by fire there, maybe a machete with its edge nicked from years of harvesting rather than killing, against rifles stacked in neat pyramids and artillery dragged across plains. It looked laughable. But then, weakness has its own vocabulary. His weapons weren't forged in arsenals. They were stitched from patience, cunning, and a willingness to use what others overlooked. A gourd could become a drum to send signals in the night. A child's song might carry coded warnings across fields without a single soldier realizing it. Fires lit on ridges mimicked ordinary cooking, but spelled out routes for retreat or ambush. Even silence, that most underestimated of tactics, worked as a blade. When an army expects noise-marching feet, shouted orders, the rattle of equipment, an enemy that simply disappears into the trees, unnerves more effectively than a volley of gunfire. Anthropologists sometimes call this guerrilla resistance, but that phrase only skims the surface. It wasn't just about hit-and-run tactics. It was about folding daily life into defiance. Women pounding grain extended the rhythm to send messages. Hunters walked trails that doubled as supply lines. Farmers who seemed to bow before soldiers actually buried food stores just deep enough that confiscation parties would pass over them. Weapons, in this sense, were everywhere, not because they were hidden, but because outsiders didn't know how to read them. The rebel himself knew that symbols could wound as deeply as steel. A banner torn from the enemy camp might be paraded in silence, the absence of words itself louder than any speech. Mockery, too, became a weapon. Foreign soldiers who strutted in polished boots were caricatured in songs that reduced them to buffoons. And those songs, spreading faster than musket fire, eroded morale long before battles did. Every time he slipped through an army's grasp, it wasn't only his skill in the terrain. It was the collective orchestration of these small acts, an invisible tide of cooperation that turned weakness into strength. To fight him meant fighting not just a man but a way of life, where survival had always required bending rather than breaking. And so armies with their heavy cannons often found themselves undone, not by firepower but by the thousand little cuts of a people refusing to yield. Yet, beneath this practical cunning, something deeper gave weight to his defiance rituals and beliefs that transformed war into a struggle not just of bodies but of spirits. Battles were never fought on muscle alone. Every strike of a blade, every ambush laid beneath the canopy, carried the invisible weight of ritual. Before men set out, elders rubbed ash on their foreheads or bound charms to their wrists, small talismans woven from bone, feather, or root. To outsiders they looked like trinkets. To those who wore them they were shields thicker than iron. The belief was simple and merciless. Without spirit on your side, even the sharpest spear would bend uselessly. Sacrifice was not metaphorical. A cock's throat slit at dawn, its blood sinking into the soil, tied the fighters' lives to the land they defended. Sometimes stronger offerings were demanded: goats, cattle, or in darker whispers, the pledge of one's own body should fortune sour. The rebel himself moved with the aura of someone marked, a man who could not be struck by bullets because the ancestors walked too closely at his heels. Whether it was true or not mattered less than the conviction it bred. Armies terrified of him often confessed later that they feared not his weapons but the eerie certainty of his men. Drumming mattered as much as strategy. Rhythms tightened the body, made fatigue seem distant, and pulled men into a trance where fear dissolved. A march accompanied by bugles and polished steps felt hollow compared to the shuddering throb of a drum that seemed to sync with the heartbeat itself. Here, war blurred into ritual possession. Men swayed, their eyes glassy, their voices rising in chants that carried more dread into enemy camps than any column of bayonets. Even the timing of attacks followed the logic of spirit. Raids often began at liminal hours, twilight, or the dead middle of the night, moments when the world was thought thinnest, when spirits crossed freely and ancestors listened more keenly. A blow struck then carried double force, material in its impact, spiritual in its echo. Defiance, in this sense, wasn't only against two nations, it was against the arrogance of believing human power stood apart from unseen forces. Foreign officers, bewildered by their repeated defeats, wrote dispatches full of complaints about superstitions. They missed the point. These rituals weren't distractions from war, they were the war. Belief stiffened the spine, masked hunger, and convinced men that retreat was impossible because the spirits themselves watched every step. And when battle ended, whether in loss or victory, purification followed. Bodies washed, charms renewed, blood offerings given again, so the cycle of defiance could continue unbroken. It was this intertwining of spirit and survival that ensured his fighters didn't scatter after each skirmish. Instead, kinship pulled them tighter. a net of obligation woven through families that turned resistance into inheritance. What marched behind him wasn't an army in the bureaucratic sense. No uniforms, no payroll, no tidy ranks. It was blood, obligation, and memory moving as one. Brothers, cousins, uncles, sons-in-law, bound less by discipline than by the shame of refusing a call to kin. Each fighter was someone's nephew, someone's father, someone's grandson. And so, when they gathered, it wasn't an abstract mobilization, but a family reunion edged with steel. Kinship worked as both recruitment and command. A man followed orders, not because they came from a superior officer, but because disobedience meant dishonoring a lineage. Defection, too, was nearly unthinkable, not just betrayal of a leader, but betrayal of ancestors whose bones still lay beneath the soil. In such a system, loyalty was not enforced by fear of punishment, but by fear of shame, which could live longer and cut deeper. Armies could bribe, threaten, or conscript, but they could not manufacture this kind of glue. The rebel understood that blood ties could be stretched like leather strap stents, flexible, unbreakable. A cousin from a neighboring valley might be called upon to provide food. An elder brother's marriage might obligate a distant clan to lend fighters. Even feuds, when suspended in the face of invasion, created alliances as potent as old friendships. Kinship was war's invisible infrastructure, carrying messages, shelter, and supplies with the same inevitability that rivers carry water. Foreign commanders often misread this web. To them, these fighters looked like a disorderly mob, lacking the hierarchy and drill they believed essential to victory. They didn't see the lattice of relations humming beneath the surface. Nor did they understand that killing one man might draw 10 avengers from his extended kin. To strike at such a force was to strike at a family tree, and family trees do not fall with a single blow. They splinter, scatter seeds, and root themselves elsewhere. So what appeared to be chaos was, in fact, an order more resilient than any marching column. Kinship ensured that even after defeat, fighters could melt back into households, only to reassemble later with renewed strength. To dismantle them, one would have to dismantle family itself. That was something no army, however vast, had the power to do. But if kinship was his hidden regiment, the gaze of empire remained the mirror against which his defiance was measured. And through that gaze, he was alternately feared, mocked, or mythologized. To his own people, he was a relative, a fighter, a man woven into the fabric of kin and land. To the foreign officers scribbling by candlelight in their field tents, he was a distortion. Reports described him as a savage one month, a prophet the next, a bandit when defeats piled up, and a natural genius of war when they grudgingly admitted his victories couldn't be written off as luck. Their words wavered like heat over sand, never able to pin him down, because what he represented refused to fit their categories. Colonial chroniclers had a habit of exaggerating the exotic. If he outmaneuvered them, surely it was witchcraft. If he endured hunger, surely it was proof of his protectiveness. What they couldn't accept was that their own armies fed, clothed, and drilled in European style were being undone by a man whose arsenal looked laughably small on paper. For bureaucrats back in the capitals, it was easier to explain away defeat as the work of superstition than to admit that the empire's carefully oiled machine was rusting in the mud. Even his image was pulled in contradictory directions. Sketches circulated, some casting him as a monstrous figure with wild hair and eyes alight with cruelty. Others romanticizing him into a noble savage, as if resistance needed to be painted either grotesque or picturesque to be legible. In both cases, he became less a man and more a projection screen, a character in someone else's story. The irony, of course, was that the more they tried to fix his identity, the more it slipped from their grasp. Meanwhile, ordinary soldiers whispered about him in tones reserved for ghosts. He was said to vanish into rivers, to ride shadows, to appear in 2 places at once. Each failed campaign only thickened the fog around his name, making him larger in defeat than he ever could have been in victory alone. Armies came to fight not just a rebel but a legend, and legends have a way of turning musket fire into futility. The colonial gaze, then, was both weapon and weakness. It painted him as less than human and more than human at once, never quite confronting him as human at all. And in that blind spot lay his freedom to keep moving, slipping across valleys and ridgelines, stepping into the liminal space between 2 nations that claimed ownership of what he knew could never be owned. The line between the two nations existed mostly in ink, drawn in distant offices where men in suits had never felt the heat of this soil or the bite of its insects. On the ground, the so-called border was a trick of imagination, a ridge where goats grazed, a river that shifted its banks after every flood, a thicket where hunters paused to drink. Armies treated it as a wall, patrolled and watched. He treated it as a seam, loose and fraying, one he could slip through with the ease of someone walking from one relative's house to another. To the authorities on either side, he was a trespasser. To his kin, he was only returning to where obligations still tied him. A cousin across the valley, an in-law by the river bend, an elder who still remembered debts owed to his grandfather. These were his passports, more valid than any stamped document. The armies thundered with their flags and borders, but their neat geometry collapsed in the face of relationships that ignored paperwork entirely. His crossings carried insult as much as strategy. When he vanished into one jurisdiction and reappeared in another, he mocked the idea that nations held sovereignty here. Soldiers, bound by protocol, could not follow him freely, but kinship knew no such restrictions. Women smuggled messages with baskets of grain. Men ferried weapons across waters that officials called international, and children played along the border trails, laughing at the foreign accents of soldiers who could not tell which side they were on. Each crossing reminded people that the map was not the land. The empire might insist this hill was theirs, that valley belonged to their rivals, but memory insisted otherwise. Ancestors were buried on both sides, rituals spilled across them. The earth did not respect the arrogance of ink, and so, when he moved between these two nations, he carried with him a living contradiction, a man who defied not just armies, but the very fiction of the states that sent them. Yet if borders could be mocked, the stories carried across them endured. Oral traditions spread his name farther than his footsteps, turning each crossing into a narrative that stretched beyond valleys and rivers. And in those stories, his defiance grew, embroidered and amplified by memory's restless hand. His battles were not preserved in stone monuments or military archives. They lived in the mouths of those who survived him. Around fires, children learned his name the way others learned prayers, repeated in rhythm, tied to melody, carried in fragments that blurred fact and myth until both became indistinguishable. Defiance, after all, doesn't need footnotes. It needs retelling. Women sang of him while grinding grain, their verses folding daily toil into quiet resistance. Hunters embroidered his escapes into stories of animals. He became the leopard who vanished into trees, the hawk who struck without warning, the river fish that slipped through nets. In this way, the man who had once outmaneuvered armies was multiplied, scattered, and transformed. He was not one rebel anymore, but 1,000 masks, each adjusted to the teller's need. Oral tradition had its own sly politics. While colonial reports framed him as outlaw or nuisance, the songs that carried his name framed him as ancestor in demaking. Children grew up believing he had walked with spirits, that bullets slid from his skin, that his laughter could frighten entire battalions. Embellishment was not error, it was survival. By enlarging him, people enlarged themselves, proving to one another that their history could not be erased by official silence. Even those who had never seen him came to claim him. Entire villages swore he had passed through, hidden in their huts, blessed their children. His presence became a kind of social currency. To be connected to him, even by rumor, gave weight to one's standing. Memory, in this sense, functioned like kinship. It tied people together, binding them in a network of shared defiance that no empire could dismantle. But memory is never neutral. As the years stretched on, stories of his victories were told more often than stories of his defeats. He became not just a man who had lived, but a myth who had never died. And myths, unlike men, have long after lives. They seep into politics, into rituals, into the way generations imagine themselves. Which is why, even long after the smoke of battles cleared, his ghost remained stalking the edges of official history, waiting to be summoned whenever resistance needed a name. Long after the rifles fell silent and the bugles rusted into memory, his shadow kept walking. Officials tried to tidy him away. Some condemned him as a bandit to be forgotten. Others rehabilitated him as a tragic patriot, suitable for a plaque in a dusty provincial museum. Yet neither category quite held. Too unruly for sainthood, too persistent for erasure, he lingered where stories and politics overlap. Inconvenient, ungovernable, alive. In villages, his name became a charm against despair. Farmers whispered it when soldiers demanded tribute, as if invoking him made the earth itself bristle with resistance. Children, daring one another at dusk, played games in which they took his role, dashing into the shadows and returning with laughter sharp enough to echo across generations. His myth proved more mobile than his body ever was, slipping past borders, nesting in songs, resurfacing each time authority grew overconfident. States, too, found themselves forced to negotiate his ghost. One nation attempted to claim him as their own hero, stamping his face on postage and currency. The other cast him as villain, a warning about what happens when primitive people resist progress. Neither version satisfied the communities that had carried his memory, who knew he belonged to neither flag. For them, he was something rarer, an ancestor who had defied armies, not because he sought a throne, but because he refused to bow. The anthropologists arrived later, notebooks in hand, eager to capture the fragment songs half-remembered, gestures reenacted, lines of genealogy that still tied families to his rebellion. They argued over categories, scribbled theories about myth-making, but missed the quieter truth, that resistance doesn't vanish when men die. It mutates, softens, and hides in lullabies, in jokes, in silences. His afterlife was not a statue or a street name. It was the stubborn continuation of memory in places where defeat was supposed to mean forgetting. And so his story closes in paradox. Armies crossed valleys to crush him. Two nations bent themselves to erase him. Yet here he remains half man, half myth, lodged in the marrow of those who still walk the same ridgelines. He defied them once with cunning and kinship, and now, long after, he defies them still with memory. For the dead may be buried, but stories, when told often enough, have a way of refusing the grave. Geronimo was never simply a man of war. He stood at that uneasy crossroads, where a people's entire sense of existence gets distilled into one body, one voice, one stubborn refusal to vanish. To outsiders, he was an outlaw who slipped through mountain passes like smoke, a fugitive who gave the U.S. Army a headache far out of proportion to his numbers. But to the Apache, he carried a heavier load, the weight of memory, medicine, and motion. His leadership was as much ritual as strategy, the kind of authority born not from crowns or laws but from visions in caves, whispers carried by wind, and the uncanny ability to survive when everything said survival was no longer possible. To imagine his world is to imagine a form of freedom no court or constitution could capture. It wasn't about deeds filed in some courthouse or fences stretching across horizons. It was about movement. The Apache were free because they could leaf slip from one valley to the next, vanish into canyons, reappear on the far side of a desert after soldiers had already congratulated themselves on their capture. Freedom was the rhythm of motion itself, the refusal to stay pinned, like trying to catch water in a clenched fist. And Geronimo embodied that refusal. His surrender, then, wasn't merely the end of a campaign, it was the pinning of a people who had built their world on never being pinned at all. Geronimo was never simply a man of war. He stood at that uneasy crossroads where a people's entire sense of existence gets distilled into one body, one voice, one stubborn refusal to vanish. To outsiders, he was an outlaw who slipped through mountain passes like smoke, a fugitive who gave the U.S. Army a headache far out of proportion to his numbers. But to the Apache, he carried a heavier load, the weight of memory, medicine, and motion. His leadership was as much ritual as strategy, the kind of authority born not from crowns or laws but from visions in caves, whispers carried by wind, and the uncanny ability to survive when everything said survival was no longer possible. To imagine his world is to imagine a form of freedom no court or constitution could capture. It wasn't about deeds filed in some courthouse or fences stretching across horizons. It was about movement. The Apache were free because they could leave slip from one valley to the next, vanish into canyons, reappear on the far side of a desert after soldiers had already congratulated themselves on their capture. Freedom was the rhythm of motion itself, the refusal to stay pinned, like trying to catch water in a clenched fist. And Geronimo embodied that refusal. His surrender, then, wasn't merely the end of a campaign, it was the pinning of a people who had built their world on never being pinned at all. Raiding was not some reckless hobby of restless warriors. It was the lifeline of a people pressed between desert hunger and foreign armies. When crops failed or game scattered, horses taken in the night meant survival. When weapons and ammunition were scarce, The quickest supply line was the enemy's camp. Raiding wasn't crime in the Apache world. It was redistribution, a correction to the imbalance that conquest had thrown onto the land. A war party wasn't just a military unit, it was a traveling pantry, a moving arsenal, a ritual affirmation that life could still be wrestled from a hostile world. The figure of the warrior was central, but not in the way Europeans imagined it. To outsiders, Apache fighters seemed like marauders, shadowy men who struck and disappeared. To their own, they were providers, guardians of mobility itself. Their survival skills were inseparable from their spirituality. To go into battle wasn't merely to fight. It was to step into a world where songs protected you, visions guided your aim, and the desert itself bent to hide your passage. War was not external to life. It was braided into it, a form of economy, of ritual, of adaptation. So when Geronimo finally laid down his rifle, it wasn't only a man surrendering, it was the symbolic end of war as a means of living. The surrender drew a line under the possibility of survival through resistance. The raiding economy, the ability to keep freedom alive through swift attacks and quicker escapes, was dismantled at the same moment he handed over his Winchester. And without that, the Apache world tilted into another, harsher reality. One where survival would be tied not to war parties and desert cunning, but to something else entirely. The sacredness of a landscape that was slipping away beneath their feet. The mountains had always been more than landmarks. They were living presences, storied bodies that watched, concealed, and guided. Apache cosmology wrapped itself around these rugged spines of earth, giving names to peaks and canyons where ancestors had once spoken with spirits. Caves held power, springs carried whispers, and ridges turned into guardians under starlight. To roam across this landscape was not simply geography, was theology in motion. Freedom meant being able to circle back to the mountain that healed you, to return to the canyon where your visions began, to walk unbroken paths between sacred points of power. When the government forced relocations, it wasn't just displacement, it was a spiritual dismemberment. Imagine being torn from mountains that had given you your dreams and dropped into flatlands with no voices, no echoes, no memory. For a people who believed the land itself was bound to their breath and bones, confinement was a kind of exile from the sacred. Geronimo's surrender sealed this exile. His people were no longer the keepers of a living geography. They became strangers on alien soil, watched over by soldiers instead of spirits. And in that shift, even the battlefield changed character. The old war of raids and skirmishes gave way to a lopsided confrontation against technologies that redefined power itself. Railroads carving straight through mountains, rifles with ranges longer than a canyon's span, telegraphs flashing news of Apache movement faster than a horse could ride. The Apache had always trusted the land to even the odds. A canyon could swallow an army whole. A ridge could turn a handful of warriors into ghosts, firing from every angle at once. But the arrival of modern technology twisted that balance. Railroads didn't just cut across the desert, they cut time itself. What once took weeks to march could now be covered in days. Telegraph wires stretched like veins across the landscape, carrying whispers faster than any scout or runner. And rifles began to speak louder and farther than a bow could dream. Geronimo had lived long enough to see this shift. The guerrilla tactics that had humiliated generals in the 1850s suddenly seemed less like divine protection and more like stubborn defiance against a machine that didn't get tired, didn't misstep, and didn't need to rest its horses. Apache stealth was legendary. But when the army could summon reinforcements by wire or ride steel tracks through mountains once thought impassable, the stealth began to feel fragile. It's one of history's darker ironies. The people most at home in that land, who knew every cactus shadow and every hidden spring, were outmaneuvered, not by skill, but by speed, steel, and logistics. And in this tightening net, diplomacy became less about negotiation between equals and more about a theater of promises, some whispered, some broken, nearly all poisoned with betrayal. Promises multiplied like mirages in the desert, shimmering, enticing, and gone the moment you reached for them. Treaties were signed, then shredded. Safe passages granted, then ambushed. Words of peace spoken, then followed by columns of cavalry. For the Apache, the very act of negotiation carried the taste of treachery. Geronimo himself learned this lesson in cycles, surrendering, escaping, returning to fight, surrendering again. Each agreement was less about mutual understanding than about temporary exhaustion on both sides. The cultural fracture was stark. To the US government, a treaty was a piece of paper meant to secure obedience. To the Apache, words were binding only if lived through action, through honor. When promises collapsed, so did the possibility of trust. Geronimo's repeated flights from confinement were less a refusal to honor his word than a refusal to accept the empty weight of theirs. He escaped because the land still called, because his people still had elders to protect, because survival didn't fit into clauses and signatures. But each escape chipped away at the illusion of negotiation. By the time of his final surrender, the balance had flipped. The government no longer sought agreement, it sought containment. Geronimo wasn't returning to the landscape of allies and enemies. He was stepping into the role of captive, of symbol, of the last. And with that came the slow grinding machinery of a new existence, where warriors were not rebels or citizens, but something more ambiguous, more suffocating, prisoners of war. The title alone carried a certain cruelty, prisoner of war. It suggested a conflict had ended, treaties were signed, and men would eventually return home. But for Geronimo and his followers, there was no home to return to, at least not in the sense they had known it. After his surrender in 1886, the Apache who had fought alongside him were loaded onto trains, guarded by bayonets, and sent far from the desert that had been both shield and sanctuary. First Florida, then Alabama, then Oklahoma. Each move felt less like relocation and more like erasure, peeling them farther from the mountains that had once given them their name. They remained prisoners for decades, even long after newspapers stopped caring. Children grew up behind fences, learning English under military watch, while their parents tried to keep alive fragments of language and ritual under the gaze of officers who measured loyalty in silence and obedience. This was captivity without sentence or trial, a form of permanent suspension where the Apache existed in the eyes of the government, not as citizens, nor as defeated enemies, but as something in between. Wards, captives, shadows of a war the state refused to let go of. Geronimo himself became both symbol and spectacle. He was trotted out at world fairs, photographed in staged poses, even allowed to ride in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, an irony thick enough to choke on. The man who had resisted the US military longer than almost any leader now paraded as proof of conquest. His image commodified while his people languished in camps. Behind the showmanship lay the deeper wound. Captivity had become a way of life. And with captivity came the slow drift from autonomy into dependency, a shift that would gnaw at the very core of what Apache freedom had meant. Rations replaced raids. Flour and salt, handed out under watch, stood where once herds of cattle taken in the night had sustained a people. Soldiers tallied beans instead of bullets, measuring submission in empty stomachs. The Apache, once masters of moving supply lines across deserts, now lined up for government-issued food, spoiled at times, meager always, and never enough to feed both body and pride. The transition wasn't merely material, it was psychological. The grinding humiliation of needing permission to eat. Farming was forced on them, but plows felt clumsy in hands that had once guided bows and rifles with uncanny precision. The land they were given was often barren, stubborn soil compared to the hunting ranges they had known. Dependency wasn't just the loss of food sovereignty, it was the dismantling of rhythm. Days once measured by the pace of a raid or the path of the sun across a canyon were now sliced into schedules imposed by others. The culture of motion shrank into the geometry of fences. And yet, dependency had its seductions. Survival meant adaptation, and some accepted the rations, the uniforms, the schools. But beneath it all lingered the uneasy truth. Autonomy had evaporated the moment Geronimo surrendered. What followed was not peace but a kind of managed hunger, the slow erosion of dignity under the pretense of civilization. Still, even in this controlled existence, memory sharpened, reshaping Geronimo into something larger than a man in confinement. He began to slip into myth-feared, romanticized, sold, and retold in ways that revealed as much about America's obsessions as about Apache endurance. Memory treated Geronimo with the same paradox it reserves for all those who refuse to disappear. To the newspapers of his time, he was a savage, bloodthirsty, untrustworthy, the embodiment of frontier terror. Yet within a few decades, his name had shifted into a strange kind of commodity. Schoolboys shouted Geronimo before jumping into rivers. His portrait was sold on postcards, Wild West shows dangled him before curious audiences as both living relic and proof that the Indian wars were finally over. The man who once made soldiers curse the desert now made them smile for photographs. This transformation said less about him than about those who consumed the story. America has always had a peculiar habit of hating a figure in life and adoring them in myth. Once the threat is safely contained, Geronimo became the last Apache holdout, the romantic rebel who symbolized freedom precisely because he no longer had it. He was stripped of his complexity, the medicine man, the negotiator, the strategist, and turned into a cartoon of resistance, a stage prop in parades of national triumph. Yet among his own, memory carried different weight. He remained the embodiment of stubborn survival, the man who had kept freedom alive longer than anyone thought possible. His name, whispered across generations, was less about nostalgia and more about endurance, about not forgetting what had been taken and what had once defined them. That duality myth for outsiders, memory for his people, ensured that even in captivity, Geronimo lived on as something larger than flesh. And from that paradox of myth, the story flows into the silence after collapse, the moment when freedom itself seemed extinguished. Yet fragments still smoldered, carried forward in language, ceremony, and the restless refusal of memory to die. The day Geronimo finally surrendered is often marked as the collapse of Apache freedom, but collapse is never so clean. On one hand, it was undeniable. The last free bands were gone, the last mountain stronghold broken, the last possibility of living ungoverned extinguished. The desert that had once sheltered them now lay under the net of forts, railroads, and telegraphs. Freedom as they had known it, mobility, autonomy, the fierce right to vanish, was gone. The surrender carved an ending into the record books, neat enough for politicians to declare the frontier closed. Yet endings in history tend to be more smoke than stone. While the world of raiding parties and hidden valleys dissolved, fragments of that freedom folded themselves into continuity. Language whispered in homes, songs carried across generations, ceremonies adapted to new landscapes. Even as dependency grew, memory refused to die. Children raised behind fences still learned the names of mountains they had never seen. Elders told stories of rivers and canyons, now far beyond their reach, and in those stories the land itself remained alive, if only in the imagination. Geronimo's surrender marked the collapse of one way of being free, but it did not erase the people who had lived it. The continuity lay in survival, however compromised, however reshaped by captivity. And perhaps that is the final irony. The very act that was supposed to signal the end turned him into a permanent symbol. His people endured, not through the freedom of movement, but through the stubborn refusal to forget what that freedom had meant. Collapse, yes, but collapse with roots that still refused to rot, no matter how many fences were built over them.